My ex-husband looked me straight in the eye at my cousin's wedding and said, "Leaving you was the smartest thing I ever did." I didn't argue. I didn't have to. Seconds later, my 4-year-old daughter ran into my arms, then reached for the man behind her and shouted, "Daddy!" My ex stopped smiling. Then he looked at her face and asked one question that told me he finally understood. Why did he suddenly turn pale? 5 years after my ex-husband walked out, he stood in front of me at my cousin's wedding and smiled like a man, expecting applause. "Leaving you was the smartest thing I ever did." He said it quietly, almost casually, as if he were telling me he had picked the right stock or bought the right house. 5 years earlier, those words might have kept me awake all night. Back then, I measured too much of my worth by the look on his face. That afternoon, I noticed something else. He still needed me to have failed. Thomas had taken Grace to find the restroom, so I had walked into the reception hall alone. The wedding was being held at a renovated farm outside Columbus, with white lights strung across the rafters and wildflowers in glass jars. I had barely signed the guest book when Nathan approached me. Melissa stood beside him. Once, she had been my closest friend. Now she smiled like we were old neighbors who had simply lost touch. She looked at me, then quickly looked away. Nathan did enough talking for both of them. He told me they had remodeled their kitchen. They had just gotten back from Arizona. Next summer, they might buy a boat. I had not asked a single question. I think that bothered him. Finally, he leaned a little closer and delivered the sentence he had probably been waiting years to say. "Leaving you was the smartest thing I ever did." I looked at him. Then I heard little shoes slapping against the wooden floor. "Mommy!" Grace ran straight into my legs and wrapped both arms around me. "Daddy and I found you." Before I could answer, Thomas came up behind her. Nathan's expression changed immediately. He knew Thomas. They had crossed paths years earlier through local business events in Columbus. "Thomas?" he said. Thomas gave him a small nod. "Nathan, had been a long time." Grace reached both arms toward Thomas. "Daddy." He picked her up without hesitation. There was nothing dramatic about it. He straightened the little clip sliding out of her hair, wiped a drop of water from her cheek, then asked if she wanted to go back to the children's table and finish coloring. Grace nodded against his shoulder. Nathan said nothing. His eyes moved from Thomas to Grace, then back to me. He studied her eyes, the small dimple in her left cheek, the shape of her face, and suddenly, the confidence he had carried into that conversation was gone. "How old is she?" I looked at him. But before I tell you why, that simple question drained the color from his face. You need to understand how our marriage died. It did not die in one night. It died a little at a time. It happened slowly. When Nathan and I first bought our little house in Worthington, there was nothing impressive about it. The kitchen cabinets were old, the furnace rattled every winter, and the driveway always needed work. But it was ours. We painted the rooms ourselves. We spent Saturday mornings at Lowe's arguing over shades of beige that looked exactly the same once they were on the wall. On Sundays, we grilled burgers on the back patio and complained about Ohio weather with the neighbors. We paid the mortgage on time. At Christmas, we drove across town twice, because neither side of the family wanted to celebrate on the same day. It was ordinary. And for a long time, ordinary felt safe. That was what made the change so hard to recognize. If Nathan had been cruel from the beginning, maybe I would have left sooner. But the first changes were small enough that I kept telling myself they were not worth fighting over. At first, he said, "We should watch the grocery bill." So I watched it. Then it became, "Why do you always spend so much?" I started comparing prices. I skipped things I wanted. I planned meals around sales. Later, he looked at a receipt and said, "You'd understand money better if you actually paid attention." That one stayed with me. Not because it was the worst thing a husband could say, but because I started believing I had earned it. His work days got longer. His phone stayed closer to him. Then he started locking it. I tried harder. I made dinner earlier. I asked fewer questions. I stopped calling when he was late because I did not want to sound needy. I thought being a good wife meant trying one more time before admitting something was wrong. The smaller I made myself, the more normal it seemed to him. Melissa became the person I leaned on most. She brought soup when I was tired. She met me for coffee and listened while I tried to explain why my own home suddenly felt uncomfortable. Sometimes she would say, "You deserve better than this." I believed her. One rainy evening, Nathan dropped his jacket over a chair. I picked it up to hang it in the closet. A folded receipt slipped from the pocket. Boutique Hotel, downtown Columbus. 2 guests, 1 room. I stared at the date. That was the night Nathan had told me he was in Cleveland. I placed the receipt on the kitchen counter and waited for him. I thought the worst thing I was about to learn was the name of some woman I had never met. I was wrong. I knew her better than almost anyone. Nathan came home a little after 9. He saw the hotel receipt on the kitchen counter before he took off his coat. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed, not like a man who had been caught, more like a man annoyed that an inconvenience had finally reached him. "Who is she?" Before he answered, headlights swept across the living room. The front door opened. Melissa walked in without knocking, the way she had done hundreds of times before. "I'm sorry." I looked at Nathan. He did not deny it. Melissa was carrying the purse I had helped her choose 3 months earlier. I remembered standing beside her in the store, comparing colors while she laughed about how bad she was at making decisions. That small memory hurt more than I expected. I used to think betrayal came from people you had failed to watch closely enough. Later, I learned the opposite. The deepest betrayals often come from people you have already decided are safe. Nathan left the house soon after. 2 weeks later, I realized my body felt different. I bought 3 pregnancy tests at CVS. All 3 were positive. I sat in my car staring at them until the windows started to fog. I was scared, angry, confused. And underneath all of that, I felt a small piece of hope I was afraid to touch. My doctor confirmed the pregnancy the next morning. The heartbeat was strong. I told Nathan because the baby deserved honesty. We met at a cafe we had visited for years. He arrived late and checked his watch before sitting down. I slid an envelope across the table. Inside was the ultrasound. "I'm pregnant." He looked at the picture, then at me. "You think this changes anything?" "No, I thought you deserved to know." He pushed the envelope back. "I don't want anything tying me to you." My hands went still. "This isn't about me. This is your child. I know." Then he stood up and left. My attorney later told me to save every email, keep every message, and write down dates. When Nathan's attorney confirmed in writing that he had been notified about the pregnancy, I printed the email and put it in a folder. Not for revenge, because facts matter when memories become convenient. I sat alone with the ultrasound in front of me and understood something. I could not decide whether Nathan would become a father. But I could decide that my child would never grow up begging someone to choose her, saying that was easier than living it. The months that followed were not dramatic. There were no big speeches, no sudden breakthroughs. There were bills. There were doctor appointments, daycare forms, grocery lists, and nights when I sat at the kitchen table with a calculator because the electric bill was higher than I expected. Grace was born healthy. Nathan was notified through the proper legal channels. He knew the date. He knew she was healthy. He knew where we lived. He did not lack an address, a phone number, or information. The only thing missing was his decision to show up. At first, I still checked my phone. The day Grace was born. The day we came home. The end of the first week. Then the first month. Eventually I stopped. I did not forgive Nathan that day. I simply stopped organizing my life around the possibility that he might become someone different. I went back to bookkeeping and payroll work sooner than I wanted. After Grace fell asleep, I took extra assignments at the kitchen table. Most nights my coffee went cold before I remembered it was there. I learned how much diapers cost when you bought them every week. I learned which daycare payments could not be late. I learned how to grade reports with one hand while rocking a baby with the other. My old Honda kept running, mostly because I asked it nicely. Little by little, things became less frightening. I was not wealthy, but I knew where next month's mortgage payment was coming from. I had a small emergency fund in case the washing machine quit. More importantly, no man could use a grocery bill or a mortgage payment to decide what I had to tolerate. That kind of independence did not feel glamorous. It felt like breathing. I saw Thomas again at a community book drive. I was carrying a box that was much heavier than I wanted to admit. At least let me carry that. I've got it. He looked at the other boxes stacked beside me. You have one. I'll take the other 3. I laughed before I meant to. He did not ask about the divorce. He did not ask why I looked tired. He just carried the books. By the time the event ended, snow had started falling. Thomas looked at my Honda, then at the road. Would you mind if I followed you home? My first instinct was to say no. Instead, I nodded. I did not know it then, but what made me trust Thomas later was not the big things he did. It was the hundreds of times he knew how to stop at a boundary I was not ready for him to cross. Even so, trusting Thomas did not come easily. One Saturday, my Honda died in the Kroger parking lot with Grace asleep in her car seat. I called roadside assistance. Thomas showed up before they did. By the time I came out with my groceries, he had already paid for a new battery. I was furious. You don't get to solve my life. He looked surprised, but he did not argue. You're right, I should have asked. That stopped me. Nathan had always made me defend my feelings until I wondered whether I had any right to them. Thomas simply admitted he had crossed a line. Driving home, I realized I was not only angry with him, I was reacting to another man who had once used money to make me feel small. A few weeks later, I started counseling. Not because I was falling apart. I went because I did not want a good person paying for survival habits someone else had taught me. Thomas had wounds of his own. One evening, after Grace was asleep, he told me quietly that he had lost his wife years earlier. I know what it feels like to lose a family, he said. That's probably why I've never understood choosing to walk away from one. He never mentioned Nathan. He did not have to. When Grace later developed pneumonia, the hospital kept her for observation. Thomas stayed both nights. He slept badly in a chair beside her bed, brought me terrible coffee, found clean clothes when I needed them, and somehow knew when to leave the room so I could have a few quiet minutes alone with my daughter. He never called any of it sacrifice. He just stayed. Months later, Grace was standing in our living room, practicing the handful of words she knew. Thomas walked through the doorway. She lifted both arms toward him. Dada! He froze. Then he quietly walked into the kitchen. I found him there wiping his eyes. I don't want you to think I'm trying to replace anyone. I put my hand on his arm. You're not replacing anyone. You're becoming the person she already trusts. Children do not understand birth certificates, DNA, or promises adults make. They understand who comes when the room is dark. Who holds them when they are sick? Whose hand is there when they reach? Our relationship grew from those ordinary moments. Later, Thomas asked me to marry him without fireworks or a fancy restaurant. I said yes. Grace grew, and somewhere along the way, Daddy became the most ordinary word in our house. Then my cousin Rachel called. "Please come to the wedding." I knew Nathan might be there. Thomas looked at me. "We don't have to go." Grace was coloring at the kitchen table. I watched her for a moment. "No, I'm tired of arranging my life around places he might be." And we went. 5 years earlier, I would have stayed home. But that afternoon, I was standing in the reception hall again, with Grace in Thomas's arms and Nathan staring at her like the room had suddenly tilted. "How old is she?" I let the question sit for a moment. 4 years and 3 months. Nathan did not answer. His eyes moved slightly, the way people do when they are counting backward and hoping the answer will somehow change. I could almost see the calendar unfolding across his face. The cafe, the envelope, the ultrasound, his own words. "I don't want anything tying me to you." The notice from his attorney. The day Grace was born. All of it was there. Melissa looked from Grace to Nathan, and for the first time since I had seen her that afternoon, the polite expression disappeared from her face. "Nathan, you knew." He said nothing. Thomas did not step between us. He did not claim Grace or make some speech about being her real father. He simply carried her back toward the children's table. Grace was already talking about crayons, cake, and the stuffed rabbit she had brought from home. That ordinary little conversation hurt Nathan more than anything I could have said. For years, I think he believed the door to fatherhood would stay open until he decided he was ready to walk through it. He had never considered that life would keep moving without his permission. Later, I watched Grace eat a piece of cake while Thomas sat beside her. Her ponytail came loose. Without thinking, he took the hair tie from his wrist and fixed it for her. Nathan watched. By then, he was no longer studying her dress or her face. He was studying habits. The kind of habits a person learns only after hundreds of mornings, sick nights, grocery trips, bedtime stories, and ordinary days. Those were the things he could not buy back. Near the end of the reception, Nathan found me alone near the doorway. "I need to talk to you." "Not here." His jaw tightened. "She's mine." I did not argue. "You knew she was yours before she was born." He looked away. I wasn't thinking clearly. "You had 4 years to think." Then I walked away. That night, my phone lit up. One voicemail, then another, then a third. "Rebecca, call me. We need to talk about my daughter." I looked at the screen and did not answer. 5 years earlier, my silence had come from fear. That night, it came from something else. I had learned that not every accusation deserves an immediate answer. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let someone keep talking and save every word. By breakfast, there were 7 voicemails. 2 days later, more than 10. At first, Nathan sounded careful. "Please call me." Then, "I just want to see her." Soon it became, "You can't keep me from my daughter." Days earlier, he had not known what Grace looked like. Now he said, "My daughter," as if 4 missing years were paperwork. I did not argue. I pulled the old divorce file from the closet. Inside were the ultrasound, attorney emails, certified mail receipts, the birth notice, and messages showing when Nathan had been informed and never responded. Thomas found me on the floor. "Do you want me here?" "Yes." I once thought keeping records meant I had not moved on. Later, I understood that memory becomes flexible when consequences become uncomfortable. My attorney told me to save voicemails, keep important communication in writing, and make any first meeting public. I sent Nathan 4 conditions. He could not call himself Dad. He could not touch Grace unless she approached him. No expensive gifts. Thomas would be there. Fine, he replied. The next morning, Grace's preschool called. A man had introduced himself as Grace's biological father. He asked which classroom she was in, when pickup started, and who usually came for her. The staff gave him nothing. He was not authorized to pick her up. I called him. Did you call her school? He said he wanted to know where his daughter spent her day. Then you ask me. He said he should not need my permission. You don't need my permission to care. You do need to respect her boundaries. He complained that Thomas did not. Thomas earned the trust you're demanding. I ended the call. That was when I understood the difference between regret and change. Regret hurts because of the consequence. Change means respecting limits your choices created. That evening, Nathan emailed me. He accused me of hiding Grace behind lawyers and letting Thomas take his place. He said he might need an attorney to correct this. Then came the line that stopped me. You had 4 years to tell her she had a real father. I found his old message. I want a clean break. Don't use this baby to keep me tied to you. Past and present sat together on my screen. Both his. I forwarded the new email to my attorney and saved it. Sometimes truth grows stronger when you let someone speak long enough for his own words to become evidence. Thomas said, whatever you decide, make it about Grace. Not him, not me. A few days later, I kept my word. 30 minutes. A public park. Nathan texted, I'll be there. I answered, remember the rules. I remember. But Saturday morning, when his black sports car entered the lot, the first thing I saw was an oversized gift box in the passenger seat. If you're still listening, please comment below and tell me how satisfied you are with the story so far. It lets me know there are still people walking beside me through this journey. Your presence is my greatest encouragement as I continue telling the final part. So much for the rules. Nathan stepped out of the car carrying a large box with a picture of an interactive doll across the front. I did not know the exact price, but I knew it was far more than anything Grace needed. Thomas and Grace were near the pond, watching ducks circle the water. I looked at the box. We agreed. No expensive gifts. Nathan glanced down at it. It's just a toy. Then why couldn't you respect one simple request? He did not answer. Instead, he carried it toward Grace. She was holding Thomas's hand when we approached. Nathan knelt down and smiled in a way that looked carefully practiced. Hi, sweetheart. Grace moved closer to me. Nathan held out the box. She looked at the doll. Then she looked at my face. Mommy, who is that man? For several seconds, nobody spoke. There was no anger in her voice, only confusion. His name is Nathan, I said. Mommy knew him a long time ago. Nathan opened his mouth. Actually, I looked at him. Not yet. He stopped. Grace did not reach for the gift. Nathan tried to encourage her, telling her the doll could talk and sing. Grace shook her head and stepped backward. No, thank you. His smile tightened. Then he took one step closer. Grace immediately moved toward Thomas and wrapped both arms around his leg. Daddy! Thomas bent down and picked her up. She rested her head against his shoulder. Nathan stared at them. You've turned her against me. That was the first moment I felt real anger. Not because he was hurt. Because he was trying to make his absence my crime. She doesn't hate you, I said. I let the next words come slowly. She doesn't know you. His face changed. I think that truth hurt more than watching Grace love Thomas. Hatred requires memories. Grace did not even have enough memories of Nathan to be angry with him. 4 years of absence had left nothing for her to hold on to. I kept my voice calm. If you want a relationship with her, Stop trying to skip to the part where she loves you. Trust cannot be backdated. It has to be built in ordinary moments, one at a time. Nathan watched Thomas carry Grace toward the walking path. How long is this supposed to take? As long as she needs. His jaw tightened. I'm her father. Biologically, yes. He looked at me, waiting for the rest. I did not say it. By then, I think he already understood. Apparently, Nathan took that anger home with him. A few days after the park, my phone lit up with a name I had not seen in years. Melissa. For a moment, I just watched it ring. 5 years earlier, I would have answered immediately. She had once been the person I called when I was scared, confused, or lonely. Now, I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I answered, I'm not asking you to forgive me, she said. Good. There was a pause. Melissa told me Nathan had been talking about Grace constantly since the wedding. At first, he sounded hurt. Then the hurt turned into blame. He said things like, if you'd stopped me. Then, if Rebecca had explained things differently. And finally, if the divorce hadn't happened so fast. Melissa said she had listened until she could not anymore. Then she told him the truth. I betrayed her, I'll own that. But abandoning Grace was yours. Nathan reminded her that she had known I was pregnant. Melissa answered, so did you. He said he had not been thinking clearly. That was when she told him, then don't rewrite history because thinking about it now hurts. I sat quietly with the phone against my ear. There had been a time when I imagined hearing Melissa admit what she had done would make me feel vindicated. It did not. Mostly I felt tired. Some apologies arrived too late to repair what they broke. That does not make them meaningless. It simply means the person receiving them may have already built a life that no longer depends on hearing them. Melissa was not asking to become my friend again. I would not have allowed that. She was finally taking responsibility for her part. I was wrong, she said, but I won't let him turn me into the reason he abandoned his child. For once, I believed her. A few weeks later, Grace's birthday was approaching. I decided not to invite Nathan. It was not punishment. Grace's birthday was not going to become an adult reconciliation experiment. We kept the party simple. Family, a few preschool friends, pizza, balloons, and cake. Everything was going well until I looked toward the entrance. Nathan was walking toward us. Behind him was a large gift with an oversized red bow. The red bow was almost as large as the little electric SUV Nathan was pushing toward us. Grace's birthday party was being held in a small room near the children's area at the Columbus Zoo. There were paper plates, pizza boxes, balloons, and a cake with pink frosting. Her grandparents were there. So were a few cousins and several children from preschool. Nothing about it was fancy. That was exactly how Grace liked it. She noticed Nathan, but she did not run toward him. She simply watched. Nathan stopped beside us and rested one hand on the toy car. I wanted to surprise my daughter. This isn't the time. His expression tightened. When is the time, Rebecca? When she's 18? Thomas came over and stood beside me. He did not speak. He did not need to. I told Nathan that he had arrived without asking, and that this was Grace's birthday, not a meeting about our past. His voice grew louder. I'm her father. Several conversations around us stopped. Then he said the words that changed everything. You kept my daughter from me. For a moment, I just looked at him. I did not yell. I did not cry. I reached into my handbag and removed a folded envelope. No, Nathan. I kept the records. His face changed. I opened the envelope carefully. The first page was the email confirming that his attorney had been notified about my pregnancy. The second was the certified mail receipt. The third was the notice sent after Grace was born. Then I showed him his own message. I want a clean break. Don't use this baby to keep me tied to you. Nathan stared at the words. I kept my voice low enough that the children across the room could not hear us. You knew I was pregnant. He said nothing. You knew she was born. His eyes dropped. You knew where we lived. I folded the papers again. You had my number. I looked directly at him. I didn't keep you away. I stopped waiting for you to show up. Pride has a strange way of rewriting the past. When our choices give us what we want, we call ourselves decisive. When the consequences finally hurt, we start calling those same choices misunderstandings. That was what Nathan was trying to do. I did not hand the papers around. I did not tell everyone about Melissa. I did not need to embarrass him. The truth was enough. Nathan looked across the room at Grace. His eyes were red now. He took a step toward her. For 1 second, I thought he might finally understand that this was not the moment to demand anything from her. He kept walking. Then he knelt in front of her. Grace, I'm your dad. Grace looked at him for a moment. She did not look angry. She did not look frightened. Mostly, she looked confused. Nathan was still kneeling in front of her, waiting for those 4 words to mean something they did not yet mean to her. Grace glanced at me. Then she turned toward Thomas. Daddy, can we go see the giraffes now? Thomas did not smile. He did not look at Nathan like a man who had won something. He simply bent a little closer to Grace. In a minute, sweetheart. That was all. No one laughed. No one applauded. The room stayed quiet for a few seconds, and I think that silence told Nathan more than any speech could have. He could argue with me. He could argue with lawyers. He could blame Melissa, blame the divorce, or even argue with his own memory. But he could not argue with 4 years of Grace's life. He could not argue with the nights Thomas had stayed awake when she was sick, the mornings he had made breakfast, or the hand she reached for without thinking. Nathan wanted the title first and hoped the relationship would follow. Thomas had done the opposite. He built the relationship one ordinary day at a time. The title came by itself. I stepped closer to Nathan and kept my voice low. Being her biological father tells her where she came from. It doesn't tell her where you were. He looked at me, but he had no answer. I took Grace's hand. Thomas walked beside us as we headed toward the door. Behind us, the little electric SUV was still sitting under its oversized red bow. Grace had never asked for it. Looking at it, I understood something else about Nathan. He had spent years believing expensive things could prove value because expensive things were easy to measure. Time was harder. You could not wrap 4 missing birthdays in a bow. You could not buy back a fever at 2 in the morning, a first word, or a frightened little hand reaching through the dark. I thought Nathan might disappear again after that day. He did not. But for the first time, he stopped demanding. A few weeks later, a small envelope appeared in our mailbox. There was no gift inside, only a card. The card was simple. There was no long apology, no expensive gift card, just a few lines asking if Grace was doing well. After that came a postcard, then a children's book, then a short letter. I kept everything in a small box in my closet. I did not hide those things from Grace. I did not force them into her hands either. One day she would be old enough to ask questions. When that day came, I would tell her the truth, not a version meant to punish Nathan, and not one meant to make him easier to forgive. Just the truth. I would never ask her to love him or hate him. Years later, when Grace understood that Nathan was her biological father, she accepted it quietly. She called him Nathan. Thomas was still Dad. No one had told her to make that distinction. She had simply lived it. I once thought the truth would force Grace to choose between two men. Eventually, I understood that truth does not ask children to choose. Adults do that. My job was to give her enough truth and enough safety to decide what she felt for herself. Later, I learned that Melissa had left Nathan. During one argument, she had finally asked him, "Do you miss Rebecca, or do you miss the family you threw away?" Apparently, he never answered. Their marriage had begun with secrecy, betrayal, and blame. When the excitement faded, those habits were still there. I did not celebrate. By then, their ending had little to do with mine. One Sunday morning, Grace stood beside Thomas at the stove and poured too many chocolate chips into the pancake batter. Thomas pretended not to notice. I poured coffee. Her shoes were by the door. One of her drawings was taped crookedly to the refrigerator. Our kitchen was not large. Our house was not impressive. Nathan probably still had the remodeled kitchen, the beautiful garage, and the things he once loved showing people. But our home was full of sound. Maybe justice does not always arrive like a verdict. Sometimes it is living long enough to understand that the thing you once dismissed is the one thing money cannot buy back. Blood can tell a child where she came from. Family is built by the people who stay. I finally understood that my value had never depended on Nathan realizing what he lost. I was free the day I stopped needing his regret to prove I had been worth loving. If you have listened all the way to the end, were you satisfied with how I handled everything? Was I right to let Grace decide what relationship she wanted with her biological father when she was old enough, or should Nathan have been given another chance sooner? Tell me in the comments.